Eli's change did not arrive with thunder or destiny or any hint that it mattered in the way stories usually insist things must. It began quietly on a Tuesday when he realized the ceiling fan in his apartment felt closer than it had the night before. He froze mid-routine, toothbrush resting against his teeth, eyes fixed upward as the spinning blades hovered uncomfortably near his head. He shifted his posture, tilting, straightening, slouching, testing perspectives, searching for a harmless explanation. Lack of sleep distorted judgment. Anxiety distorted it further. He finished brushing, stepped away from the sink, and reminded himself not to overthink it. Within a week, overthinking was unavoidable. No matter which pants he pulled on, fabric crept up his ankles. Reflections in glass storefronts seemed subtly wrong, stretched in a way that made him look like a poorly scaled image. Friends joked that he must be growing again, and Eli played along because humor was simpler than articulating the quiet dread settling in his chest. He scheduled a medical visit, then another, then more. Each time he was measured, then measured again. Tools were checked, posture corrected, expressions tightened, the numbers climbed in ways they shouldn't. Adults didn't grow like this, certainly not continuously, certainly not without end. Yet Eli continued. His living space stopped fitting him. First it was awkward, then impossible. He ducked through doorways, slept at angles, memorized where every light fixture hung. Outdoors felt different too, as if the environment itself had grown delicate. He slowed his movements, placing each step deliberately, as though the ground might recoil if startled. Strangers stared. Cameras lifted. Voices called out, some curious, some hostile. Eli kept his gaze low, his hands open, trying to express safety through stillness. Medical concern escalated into public obsession. Specialists appeared. Then analysts. Then headlines that stripped complexity into spectacle. Some framed him as ill, others as advanced. One talk show host declared him a sign of judgment. Eli turned the television off and left it off. When he rose above the rooftops, the city adapted. Roads emptied ahead of him. Work paused in his wake. Emergency sirens learned patience. Space was given not as courtesy, but as requirement. Eli felt the uncomfortable shame of someone who caused harm simply by being present. He apologized constantly, though no one had asked him to. His voice, now low enough to rattle glass, stayed soft by choice. Through all of it, his thoughts remained ordinary. He worried about where he could rest, whether his mother felt afraid watching the news, whether touch would ever again be safe. He remembered holidays, half-forgotten songs, the smell of rain on warm asphalt. Growth hadn't removed his humanity, it had only repositioned it. Eventually, remaining near people became dangerous for everyone involved. He was guided outward toward open spaces where the risk diminished. Pavement gave way to fields. Skylines dissolved into treetops. Forests brushed his legs, then his knees, then failed to reach higher as he continued to expand. Wildlife scattered at first, then cautiously returned once his rhythms became familiar. Eli learned stillness, letting the world settle around him instead of forcing himself into it. Time loosened. Days blurred. Years softened. He watched seasons move across continents like slow, deliberate breaths. Snow settled on his shoulders and vanished. Rain soaked him without cold. Storms revealed their logic. He could feel their formation before they arrived, pressure aligning like thought before speech. The first time he entered the ocean, it met him with resistance and welcome both, waves collapsing against his legs in white patterns that vanished as quickly as they formed. His laughter rolled outward, deep and thunderous, surprising him with its sincerity. As scale lost familiarity, simplicity emerged. Borders ceased to matter. Names lost weight. From above, cities no longer looked like monuments but messages, clusters of light signaling persistence and hope. He traced rivers altered by hands, lands wounded and healed and wounded again. In stone and sediment, he read patience. In erosion, forgiveness. Eventually, he rose beyond air itself. Blue faded to black. Atmosphere released him. Sound disappeared into a silence that felt full rather than empty, like the pause before something meaningful. Earth curved below, fragile, radiant, wrapped in cloud. He held it gently, not as something owned, but something entrusted, aware of how easily care could become destruction. It was warm. It was alive. Drifting outward felt less like movement and more like acceptance. Stars expanded from points into places, burning with ages older than fear. Eli felt no terror, only calm spreading wider and wider as if this direction had always been implied. He was not abandoning humanity. He was finally seeing it whole. Thought slowed but deepened. He stopped asking when the growth would end. The question lost relevance. Growth was no longer a problem. It was a condition of being. He recognized the same motion in the universe itself, stretching, learning, becoming. In that, he found company. Eli continued beyond measurement, beyond speech, beyond the need to be explained. He became a moving edge, a steady presence, proof written into gravity that nothing remains fixed forever. Far behind him, people still stared upward, inventing stories from points of light, and drifting through the dark, larger than worlds, yet still holding the memory of a quiet Tuesday and a ceiling fan spinning just a little too close, Eli kept growing. Not to rule, not to flee, but to know. Here is part 2, written to closely match the length, tone, and reflective scale of part 1. At first, nothing seemed to follow Eli beyond the familiar universe. He expected silence to remain empty, distance to remain merely distance, but as he grew, space itself responded. Gravity bent toward him in subtle ways, not enough to trap stars or tear galaxies apart, but enough to acknowledge his presence, the way water acknowledges a stone lowered carefully into it. He became aware of forces he had never needed to think about before. Tides without oceans, pressure without touch, motion without direction. Growth no longer felt like becoming larger so much as becoming elsewhere. He passed through regions where light thinned and reddened, where ancient radiation whispered stories of beginnings long finished. Time behaved strangely here. Events did not line up neatly. Moments overlapped, stretched, folded. Eli found that memory no longer stayed behind him. He could feel it beside him, around him. Childhood was not smaller than adulthood. It was simply nearer or farther, depending on how he turned his attention. He remembered the sound of cutlery at dinner tables, the weight of keys in his pocket, the way a room felt just after someone left it. These things did not fade. They scaled. As Eli expanded, so did his capacity to notice. He began to perceive patterns in stellar motion, subtle synchronizations between distant systems, rhythms spanning millions of years that echoed like slow music. He realized the universe was not quiet, it was patient. Every explosion, every collapse, every orbit was part of a conversation taking place on timescales too large for urgency. His growth tuned him into that dialogue, not as a speaker, but as a listener whose presence slightly altered the acoustics. Far behind him, Earth continued. He could no longer see it with clarity, but he felt it as a persistent warmth, a familiar note in the vast chord of existence. He sensed generations turning over, fears replaced by new ones, kindness recurring in different forms. Humanity's signal did not weaken with distance, it changed frequency. From this scale, individual suffering blurred, but compassion did not disappear. It became statistical, structural, embedded in probabilities and tendencies. Eli understood then that caring was not diminished by scale, it was transformed by it. At some point, growth carried him beyond the structures he recognized as galaxies. Clusters thinned, darkness deepened. Here, expansion was more obvious, space stretching faster than light could neatly traverse. Eli felt himself growing with it, not against it, like a seam moving as fabric is woven. He wondered briefly if he was becoming dangerous again, if his presence might one day disrupt what existed. The thought passed, not dismissed, but absorbed. He understood now that destruction and creation were not opposites. They were phases sharing the same process. Eli encountered phenomena that had no names. Regions where physics bent gently, where constants softened and reasserted themselves like tentative agreements. He did not intervene. He had learned restraint early, back when cities were fragile beneath his feet. He remained careful still, even when care seemed unnecessary. Growth had taught him that power was not measured by what could be altered, but by what was deliberately left untouched. His sense of self stretched. Eli was no longer just a body or a history, but a continuity, a thread running through expanding contexts. He was not dissolving, but he was no longer bounded. Thoughts arrived that did not use language. Understanding came without explanation. He perceived how universes might form like bubbles, how endings folded into beginnings, how laws emerged not from command but from repetition. The cosmos was not designed, it was practiced. Eventually, Eli noticed something unexpected. He was no longer the only anomaly. Growth, it turned out, was not unique. Across incomprehensible distances, he sensed other presences, not identical, not even similar in origin, but comparable in scale. They were not beings in any familiar sense, but processes that had become aware of themselves, expansions that noticed they were expanding. Like him, they observed without conquest. Like him, they remembered small things. There was no greeting, no exchange. Awareness brushed awareness briefly, respectfully. Eli felt less alone than he ever had, not because he had company, but because solitude no longer implied isolation. Even singular things belonged to patterns. As he grew further still, Eli approached limits, not of size, but of distinction. Differences smoothed, boundaries blurred. The universe ahead of him felt less like a place and more like a condition, something on the verge of changing into something else. He sensed that growth might eventually become indistinguishable from the medium it moved through, that one day there would be no clear line between himself and expansion itself. The idea did not frighten him. He thought again of Earth, of the way people looked up at the sky searching for meaning, unaware of how much meaning was already embedded in persistence alone. He wished, briefly, that he could reassure them, that they were not small in the ways that mattered, that existence noticed effort, that growth did not require escape. The wish did not travel, but it remained true regardless. Eli continued onward, growth now less a change than a constant, like time once was. He did not know whether there would be an end or whether an end was even the correct shape for such a thing. Perhaps the universe would stop expanding. Perhaps he would. Perhaps stopping and becoming the same thing were identical outcomes. For now, he grew, not as a conqueror, not as a warning, but as a continuation, a memory with mass, a perspective still unfolding, a quiet affirmation that nothing once begun ever truly stands still.